Stay in your place, Victor Caldwell said, not loudly, not angrily, but with the kind of quiet certainty that made the entire dining room go still, as if the air itself had been told to stop moving, and for a second even the soft hum of the chandelier lights seemed to hesitate above the polished marble table stretching nearly 20 feet across the center of the room, where crystal glasses caught the warm glow and reflected it in fractured gold across the walls, while Ava Johnson stood at the far end with a silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, her posture straight, her expression composed, though the weight of his words pressed against her chest like something heavier than the tray itself, something colder, something that didn't belong to her but had been handed to her anyway the moment she stepped into this house wearing a uniform instead of a name. Around the table, men in tailored suits shifted subtly, some lowering their eyes, others pretending to study the documents in front of them, and one woman let out a faint, polite laugh that didn't quite land, dissolving quickly into the silence that followed, a silence that felt curated, controlled, the way everything in Victor Caldwell's world was controlled, from the temperature set at exactly 72 degrees to the timing of each course served down to the minute, to the people who moved through his space like shadows expected to remain unseen. Ava lowered the tray just enough to set down the final glass, the stem touching the table with a soft, precise click, her fingers steady despite the way her pulse moved faster beneath her skin, and she stepped back exactly 2 paces as trained, eyes lowered just enough to signal respect but not submission, though she knew in rooms like this the difference rarely mattered, because what mattered was what people chose to see, and most of them had already decided long before she entered that she was background, function. Silence. Victor leaned back in his chair, the leather creasing beneath him as he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease, his gaze sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture, something useful but ultimately replaceable, and yet his voice lingered in the air, threading through the room like a line drawn in permanent ink, dividing what could be said from what should never be said, and for a moment Ava's eyes lifted, just slightly, catching the reflection of the city skyline in the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Miles of glass and steel stretching into the distance, a world built on decisions made in rooms like this. Decisions she had learned to understand long before she ever stepped into one, though no one here knew that. No one here saw the quiet calculations behind her calm, the way she noticed the folder left half open near Victor's hand, the numbers glimpsed in passing, the detail that didn't quite align, a small fracture hidden beneath layers of confidence, and she felt it then, not as an urge, not as defiance, but as something steadier, something rooted deeper than fear. The quiet awareness that sometimes the truth sits in a room waiting for someone willing to risk being seen to speak it, and as the glasses settled, as the murmurs began to return, as the meeting edged forward again, Ava stood there for a breath longer than she should have, the weight of choice gathering in the stillness before the next moment began. The room moved on as if nothing had happened, but Ava did not entirely, because even as she stepped back into the quiet rhythm expected of her, hands clasped lightly in front of her apron, shoulders relaxed, gaze lowered just enough to avoid attention, her mind remained fixed on the brief glimpse she had caught, that single line buried in the document near Victor Caldwell's hand. A number that did not align with the surrounding projections, a clause that seemed to lean in the wrong direction, subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless someone was looking for it, and Ava had always been someone who looked, not out of curiosity alone, but because she had learned early that small details often carried the weight of larger truths, lessons shaped in dimly lit apartments where bills were counted down to the last dollar, where her mother worked double shifts and still found the strength to remind her that understanding how the world worked was a form of protection no one could take away. She shifted her weight slightly, the polished floor cool beneath her shoes, and listened as the conversation at the table resumed, voices smooth and practiced, words like leverage, equity, compliance moving through the air with ease, and yet beneath them she heard something else, a quiet imbalance, like a rhythm slightly offbeat, and her eyes lifted again, just for a second. Enough to catch the way one of the investors avoided direct answers, the way another tapped his pen too quickly against the edge of his folder, subtle signs most people would dismiss but that she recognized as hesitation disguised as confidence. Ava turned toward the service corridor, the soft swing of the door absorbing her into the dimmer light beyond the dining room, where the scent of polished wood gave way to something more neutral, more practical, and the quiet hum of refrigeration units replaced the curated silence of wealth. And for a moment she paused there, alone, the tray now empty in her hands, her reflection faint in the stainless steel surface of a nearby counter, and she saw herself as others did, a maid in a borrowed uniform, a presence meant to pass unnoticed, and yet she also saw what they did not, the late nights spent studying borrowed textbooks, the notes written in margins, the scholarships nearly within reach before life had shifted its weight in a different direction. And the knowledge that had not disappeared simply because her circumstances had changed. A voice called her name from further down the hallway, a reminder to keep moving, to stay within the boundaries that had been drawn for her, and Ava nodded, setting the tray aside, but her hands lingered for just a second longer than necessary, her fingers brushing the cool metal as if grounding herself in the moment, because beyond the door the meeting was moving forward, decisions being made, signatures likely to follow. And she understood exactly what that meant, the scale of it, the consequences that would ripple far beyond this house, and she felt it again, that steady pull between silence and responsibility, between staying invisible and stepping into a space that was not meant for her, and when she finally turned back toward the dining room, her steps were measured, deliberate, each one carrying the quiet weight of a choice not yet spoken but already beginning to take shape inside her. When Ava stepped back into the dining room, the air felt different, tighter somehow, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen, and the conversation at the table had sharpened into something more focused, more decisive. Victor Caldwell now standing near the head of the table with one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, his presence anchoring the room in a way that made everyone else orbit around him. And the documents had been spread wider across the polished surface. Pages aligned with almost surgical precision, numbers and clauses waiting to be confirmed, approved, sealed into something permanent. Ava moved along the perimeter as expected, silent, unobtrusive, refilling a glass here, adjusting a plate there, but her attention remained fixed on the open folder now turned slightly toward the center, the same page visible again, the same clause hidden beneath dense legal phrasing. And this time she saw it more clearly, the language that shifted responsibility. In a way that did not match the verbal assurances being exchanged, a quiet redirection of risk, subtle enough to pass through unnoticed unless someone understood how these structures were built, and Ava felt her breath slow, her thoughts aligning with a clarity that surprised even her, because it was no longer a question of whether something was wrong, it was a question of what would happen if no one said it out loud. Victor's voice cut through the room again, calm, controlled, outlining the final steps before signing, his confidence steady, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had made decisions like this 100 times before without hesitation, and around him the investors nodded, some eager, some cautious, but none interrupting, none challenging the momentum that had been carefully constructed to move in only one direction. Ava paused near the far end of the table, her hands still, the faint reflection of the overhead lights catching along the edge of the silver pitcher. She held, and she felt the room as a whole, the quiet pressure of expectation, the unspoken rule that she did not belong in this moment except as background, except as function, and yet the knowledge inside her did not fade, it did not quiet itself just because the setting demanded silence, instead it pressed forward, insistent, grounded in something deeper than fear, something that had been shaped long before this house, long before this uniform, in spaces where speaking up was not about status, but about survival. One of the investors slid a pen across the table toward Victor, the small movement carrying more weight than it should have, and Victor reached for it without hesitation, his fingers closing around it with the ease of habit, and Ava saw it then, not just the clause, not just the imbalance, but the outcome, the way the numbers would shift once the ink touched the page. The consequences unfolding in quiet increments that no one here seemed prepared to face, and for a brief second the room seemed to narrow, the edges blurring as everything focused on that single moment, the distance between silence and action collapsing into something immediate. Ava's grip on the pitcher tightened slightly, then steadied, her shoulders settling as if aligning with a decision already made somewhere beneath conscious thought, and before the pen could lower, before the next step could become irreversible, she took a single step forward. Small but unmistakable, her voice emerging not Loud but clear, steady enough to cut through the controlled calm of the room, carrying just enough weight to interrupt without shouting. "Sir, that clause does not protect your company." And the words hung there, suspended in the air like something fragile and undeniable at the same time, and for the first time since she entered the room, every eye turned toward her not as background, not as function, but as presence, and the silence that followed was no longer controlled, no longer curated, it was uncertain, shifting, alive with the possibility that something had just changed. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was deciding whether to acknowledge what had just happened or pretend it had not, and Victor Caldwell did not look at Ava right away, his hand still holding the pen just above the paper, his posture unchanged, but something in his stillness shifted, subtle enough that only someone watching closely would notice, and when he finally turned his head, his gaze settled on her with a calm that felt sharper than anger, colder than dismissal. The kind of attention that measured before it judged. No one spoke, not the investors, not the assistants, not even the woman who had laughed earlier, because the interruption had cut across an invisible boundary that everyone in the room understood but no one had ever needed to explain, and Ava stood there, the weight of every eye pressing against her, but she did not step back, did not lower her voice further, she simply held her ground, her hands steady at her sides, her breathing even, as if she had already accepted whatever consequence would follow. Victor's expression remained composed as he set the pen down slowly, the soft click against the table louder than it should have been, and he leaned forward just slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the document. "Repeat that," he said, his tone even, controlled, but carrying an edge that made the air feel thinner. Ava did not rush, she took one small step closer to the table, just enough to see the page clearly without reaching for it, her eyes scanning the lines she had already memorized. And when she spoke again, her voice did not waver. "The liability clause on page 14 shifts full responsibility to your company if the partnership defaults, even under conditions outside your control." And a ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged between two men near the far end of the table, the faint tightening of a jaw that had been relaxed moments before. Victor's eyes flicked down to the page, then back to her, his silence stretching again, not empty this time, but filled with calculation, and someone let out a quiet exhale, another adjusted his chair, the carefully maintained confidence in the room beginning to fracture at the edges. One of the investors cleared his throat softly, attempting to reclaim the moment. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding," he said, his smile thin, practiced, but it did not land the way it had earlier, because doubt had already entered the space and it did not leave easily once it arrived. Ava did not respond to him, her focus remained on Victor, because this was his decision, his risk, his signature waiting to be placed, and she knew that anything she said now would either be dismissed completely or considered fully. There was no middle ground. Victor reached for the document again, not to sign, but to turn the page back, his eyes scanning quickly now, more intent than before, and the room watched him, watched the shift in his attention, the way his confidence recalibrated in real time, and for the first time since the meeting began, the momentum slowed, no longer moving in one direction, but suspended between what had been assumed and what might actually be true. Then his gaze lifted. Again, sharper now, more focused. "And how exactly would you know that?" he asked, not raising his voice, but directing it with precision, and the question hung there, not just about the clause, but about her place in this room, about the line she had just crossed without permission, and Ava felt the weight of it, felt the room waiting for her answer, not as background anymore, not as something invisible, but as something that needed to be explained, justified, contained, and yet she did not retreat, she did not soften her stance, she simply met his gaze with the same steady calm she had carried from the moment she stepped forward, because the truth she held did not depend on where she stood, and the silence that followed was no longer controlled by him alone. Ava held his gaze for one steady breath before answering, not quickly, not defensively, but with the quiet clarity of someone who understood exactly what she was saying and why. "Because the wording separates operational control from financial liability, and that imbalance only protects the other side." And the words landed differently this time, not as an interruption, but as something that demanded to be processed, and for a moment Victor Caldwell did not respond, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked back down at the page, scanning with more intention now, while around the table the atmosphere shifted again, the earlier confidence dissolving into something less certain, less controlled, and one of the men near the center leaned forward just enough to get a better look at the document, his fingers tapping once against the margin before going still. Then Victor leaned back, slowly, deliberately, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and when he looked at her again, the calm in his expression had hardened into something sharper, something more defined. "You are a maid," he said, not raising his voice, but making the statement sound final, absolute, as if it alone should be enough to end the conversation, and a few faint nods followed from around the table, the room trying to restore its balance by placing her back where she belonged. Ava did not react to the label, did not deny it, did not defend herself against it, she simply stood there, still and composed, her silence not empty but grounded, and that made the moment stretch longer than anyone expected. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, his patience thinning in a way that showed through the precision of his movements. "This is not your place," he continued, his tone cool, measured, "and you are interrupting a decision you do not understand." And this time there was a shift in the room, a subtle easing among the investors, as if the familiar order had been restored, as if authority had reasserted itself. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the space she occupied, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less steady. "I understand enough to know that once it is signed, there is no reversal." And that line, simple as it was, seemed to press against the room in a way that could not be dismissed as easily. Victor exhaled slowly through his nose, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and then he reached for the pen again, this time with intention, as if to close the moment, to move forward and leave her words behind where they belong. "Escort her out," he said, without looking at her, his attention already returning to the document as if the decision had been made and nothing further needed to be said. A staff member stepped forward from the side of the room, hesitant for a fraction of a second before placing a light hand near Ava's arm, not forceful, but firm enough to signal that her presence was no longer permitted. And the distance between her and the table widened as she took a step back, then another, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, though the weight of what had just happened settled quietly beneath the surface. As she reached the doorway, she paused for just a moment, not turning fully, but allowing her voice to carry one last time across the room. "It is hidden in subsection C, third paragraph." And then she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room to its decision, to its momentum, to the sound of a pen finally touching paper, and for a moment everything seemed to return to normal. But not entirely, because something had been said that could not be unheard, and even as the meeting continued, the certainty that had filled the room at the beginning no longer sat as comfortably as it once had. The hallway felt colder than the dining room, not in temperature but in tone, the polished surfaces reflecting a quieter kind of silence that did not belong to wealth but to distance, and Ava walked steadily, each step measured, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble echoing just enough to remind her that she was alone now, removed from the room where decisions had already been set in motion. And yet the weight she carried was not regret, not exactly, but something more complex, a quiet tension between what she had done and what she already knew would follow. She reached the service corridor again and paused near the narrow window at the end, where the city lights stretched out in long lines of gold and white, blurred slightly by the thin mist gathering against the glass, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe fully, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the pressure eased from her chest, though it did not disappear entirely, because the sound of that pen touching paper still echoed faintly in her mind, a small action with consequences that would not reveal themselves immediately but would arrive all the same. She rested her fingertips lightly against the cool surface of the window, grounding herself in the present, and her reflection stared back at her, quiet, composed, unchanged on the surface, though she could feel the shift beneath it. The way a single decision had altered something internal, something that could not be undone, and yet she did not second-guess it, not truly, because the truth she had spoken had not been impulsive, it had been certain. Down the hall, a door opened and closed, distant voices moving through routine, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge what had just unfolded, and Ava stepped away from the window, her hands returning to rest calmly in front of her as she resumed the role expected of her. Though the stillness she carried now was different, deeper, not passive but deliberate, as if she had stepped through something invisible and could not return to the version of herself that had existed before. Time passed in quiet increments, minutes stretching into something longer as the house settled into its usual rhythm, and eventually the meeting behind those closed doors came to an end, footsteps echoing faintly through the corridor, voices low, controlled, but edged with something new, something unsettled, and Ava did not move toward them, did not try to listen. She simply remained where she was, centered, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without her. Then the hallway fell silent again, heavier this time, as if the outcome had finally settled into place, and somewhere deeper in the house a door closed with a soft finality that seemed to carry more meaning than sound, and Ava understood without needing to be told that something had shifted beyond her presence, beyond her reach. And she stood there for one last breath, her eyes lifting once more toward the distant skyline, before turning away, her steps quiet, steady, carrying her forward into whatever would come next, not with certainty of outcome, but with certainty of who she had chosen to be in that moment. The next morning did not arrive with noise or urgency, but with a quiet tension that settled into the walls before anyone spoke it aloud, and inside Victor Caldwell's office the sunlight stretched across the glass desk in long, sharp lines that reflected off untouched documents, the same contract now lying open again, its pages no longer symbols of certainty but of something overlooked, something missed, and Victor stood by the window, one hand resting against the cool surface of the glass, his reflection staring back at him with a stillness that did not match the movement inside his thoughts. He had not slept, not fully, because every time he closed his eyes the same line returned, the same clause, the same quiet voice that had cut through his certainty without raising itself, and he had gone back to the document alone, long after the room had emptied, long after the others had left believing the deal was secured. And he had read it again, slower this time, without the rhythm of the room guiding him, without the confidence that had carried him forward, and there it was, exactly where she had said, subsection C, third paragraph, written with precision, hidden in plain sight, shifting everything. His jaw tightened slightly as he replayed the moment, not her words, but his own, the way he had dismissed her, reduced her to a role instead of hearing what she had actually said. And the realization did not arrive all at once, it settled in layers, quiet but undeniable, the kind that did not allow for easy dismissal. Across the room, his assistant stood waiting, tablet in hand, posture straight, but even she seemed aware that something had shifted, the usual rhythm of the morning interrupted by a silence that carried more weight than any spoken command, and when Victor finally turned from the window, his movements were slower, more deliberate, as if recalibrating something internal that had always operated without question. "Pull the full liability breakdown," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the sharp certainty it carried before, and the assistant nodded quickly, moving to comply, her fingers tapping across the screen as the data loaded, each second stretching longer than it should have, and when she finally looked up, her expression had changed, subtle but clear, the kind that did not need explanation. Victor did not ask immediately, he already understood enough, and he walked back toward the desk, his eyes scanning the figures as they aligned with what he had missed, what she had seen in seconds, and the numbers did not lie, they confirmed it, every risk, every exposure, every shift in responsibility falling exactly where it should not have, and for the first time in a long time, Victor Caldwell did not feel in control of the outcome in front of him. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of authority, it was the silence of recognition, of something undeniable taking shape, and he exhaled slowly, his hand resting against the edge of the desk as if grounding himself in something real. Something that could not be adjusted with a signature or dismissed with a command, and in that moment, the image of Ava standing at the edge of the room returned, not as a servant, not as background, but as the only person who had seen clearly when everyone else had not, and the weight of that realization settled in fully, quiet, irreversible, and for the first time, it was not the deal he was thinking about, it was her. By late afternoon, the house had returned to its usual rhythm on the surface, staff moving quietly through hallways, doors opening and closing with soft precision, the kind of controlled normalcy that masked anything unresolved beneath it. But in Victor Caldwell's office, nothing felt settled, not entirely, and he stood once more at the window, the city stretching out beneath him in sharp lines and distant motion. A world that had always responded to his decisions without hesitation, without question, until now. The contract lay closed on his desk, no longer a symbol of control but of something narrowly avoided, something he had almost sealed with his own hand, and the thought did not sit comfortably, it stayed with him, pressing quietly against his certainty, reshaping it in ways he could not ignore. He turned from the window with a steadier pace this time, not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate, and reached for his jacket draped over the back of his chair, the fabric smooth beneath his fingers as he put it on, each movement precise, measured, as if aligning himself with a decision that required more than authority to carry out. "Where is she assigned today?" he asked without looking up, his voice calm but carrying a weight that his assistant recognized immediately, and within seconds the answer came, clear, efficient. "Service wing, second floor. Rotation." And Victor nodded once, already moving toward the door before another word could be added. The hallway outside felt different than it had before, not because it had changed, but because his presence within it had, and for the first time he noticed details he had never paid attention to, the quiet coordination of staff, the way footsteps softened near corners, the way conversation stopped just before he passed. Not out of respect alone, but out of distance, and he moved through it. Without slowing, his focus narrowing on something ahead rather than everything around him. When he reached the service corridor, the light shifted, cooler, less curated, the air carrying the faint scent of cleaning solution and polished surfaces, and at the far end, near a linen cart neatly arranged with folded towels, Ava stood, her posture the same as before, composed, steady, her attention on the task in front of her. As if nothing had changed, as if the moment from the night before had dissolved into routine. Victor stopped a few feet away, not announcing himself immediately, and for a brief second he simply observed, not as an employer evaluating a task, but as someone trying to understand something he had missed, something that did not fit within the structure he was used to controlling. And when Ava finally looked up, meeting his gaze without surprise, without hesitation, the space between them felt different, not defined by hierarchy alone, but by something unspoken that had shifted overnight. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "I reviewed the contract again." And the words hung there, simple, direct, carrying more meaning than explanation, and Ava did not respond immediately, she simply listened, her expression calm, attentive, as if allowing him the space to continue. Victor took one step closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to change the dynamic, enough to signal that this was no longer a dismissal, no longer a command. "You were right," he said, and the statement settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be undone, not because of the words themselves, but because of who was saying them, and for the first time, the authority in his voice did not come from control, it came from acknowledgement, quiet, unfamiliar, but real. Ava did not answer right away, not because she needed time to think, but because the moment itself did not call for more words, and the quiet between them carried more meaning than anything she could add, the soft hum of the hallway lights settling into the space as if even the building understood that something had shifted beyond routine. She lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement, her hands returning to the folded towels in front of her, smoothing the fabric with slow, deliberate movements, the texture cool beneath her fingertips, grounding, steady, unchanged, and that steadiness seemed to extend outward, softening the tension that had once defined every interaction in this house. Victor remained where he was for a second longer, watching not the task itself but the way she moved through it, the absence of urgency, the absence of performance. As if her worth had never depended on being seen, and something in that realization settled into him, quiet but irreversible, reshaping the sharp edges of certainty he had carried for so long. He glanced briefly at the corridor behind him, the long stretch of polished floor reflecting the overhead lights and clean lines, a space he had walked through countless times without noticing, and now each detail felt different, not because it had changed, but because he was seeing it without the filter of control. Without the assumption that everything within these walls existed to respond to him. Ava finished folding the last towel and placed it neatly onto the cart, aligning it with the others, the small motion precise, complete, and when she stepped back, the air between them felt lighter, not resolved, not erased, but balanced in a way it had not been before. Victor exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and gave a single nod, not as a command, not as a dismissal, but as something quieter. Something closer to recognition, and then he turned, his footsteps measured as he walked back down the corridor, the sound of them softening as the distance grew, blending into the natural rhythm of the house. Ava did not watch him leave for long, only a brief glance before her attention returned to the cart, to the simple order of the work in front of her, and outside the narrow window at the end of the hall, the light shifted slightly, the late afternoon sun lowering just enough to cast a warmer glow across the floor, softening the edges of everything it touched. The house remained still, the kind of stillness that does not demand attention but holds it anyway, and in that quiet, nothing needed to be said, because what had changed did not live in words, it lived in the space between them, in the absence of something that had once been there, and in the presence of something new, something quieter, something real. And as Ava lifted the cart and began to move again, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, the light followed her for just a moment longer before settling back into place, leaving behind a silence that felt complete.